48 kilometers. That's how close he got. 48 kilometers from breaking the largest encirclement in the history of modern warfare and pulling an entire German army out of the trap that would become the turning point of World War II. His tanks were close enough that his soldiers could reportedly see the glow of burning buildings on the horizon. And then the advance stopped, and 300,000 men were left to die in the snow. His name was Hermann Hoth, and that moment, 48 kilometers short of Stalingrad, is just one chapter in a career that ran from the trenches of World War I to the biggest tank battles in human history. He was one of the men who built the German way of war that shocked the entire world in 1940. And he ended up in a courtroom in Nuremberg, convicted not for losing battles, but for what happened to civilians in the territory his armies moved through. This is the full story. Hermann Hoth was born on April 12, 1885, in Nuremberg, Prussia. Military family, cadet corps, the standard path for ambitious young Germans of his generation. Nothing about his early life suggested anything unusual, just a serious, capable young man moving through the Prussian military system with the kind of steady competence that the system was designed to identify and reward. He served in World War I, gained experience in infantry command and staff work, watched Germany lose. And when the war ended and the army was cut to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, Hoth was one of the officers selected to stay. That mattered. When the military is cutting almost everyone, being kept means something. It meant the institution considered you worth investing in. Through the 1920s, he kept climbing, quietly, professionally, without the political maneuvering that some officers used to advance their careers. He wasn't close to the Nazi hierarchy. He wasn't a party fanatic. He was just genuinely good at the craft of military command, at a time when Germany was secretly rebuilding the military machine that the peace treaty was supposed to have destroyed forever. By the late 1930s, he was a corps commander, and Hitler's Germany was about to start a war. The German army that invaded Poland in September 1939 was something the world had never quite seen before. Fast, coordinated, built around armored formations that moved deeper and faster than any defender could respond to. The concept had been developing for years. Tanks not as infantry support weapons crawling alongside foot soldiers, but as independent strike forces that could punch through enemy lines, drive into rear areas, destroy command structures, and create chaos faster than anyone could organize a response. Hoth understood this instinctively. He was one of the commanders who grasped what tanks could actually do if you stopped treating them like expensive infantry and started using them like a fist to the jaw. Poland went fast, overwhelming, over in weeks. It was a preview. Then came France, May 1940. The German plan for France was built on an idea so bold it was almost crazy. While Allied attention was focused on the obvious German advance through Belgium in the north, the real strike would come through the Ardennes forest, terrain the French considered completely impassable for armored forces, which is exactly why the Germans chose it. Hoth commanded one of the panzer groups in this operation. His forces crossed the Meuse River at Dinant, fighting their way across under heavy fire, establishing a bridgehead, then exploding westward before the French could react. The speed was the weapon. The Allied commanders were always responding to where the Germans had been, never to where they actually were. By the time a defense was organized, the situation had already changed completely. France fell in 6 weeks, one of the most stunning military collapses in modern history. Britain evacuated whatever it could from Dunkirk and got out. And Hoth was one of the men who made it happen. But France was a warm-up act. What was coming next was on a completely different scale. June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, nearly 4 million men crossing into the Soviet Union simultaneously on a front stretching thousands of kilometers. The largest military invasion in human history, launched against the largest country in the world. Hoth commanded Panzer Group 3, operating in the central sector alongside Heinz Guderian's Panzer Group 2. Together, they were the armored core of Army Group Center, the most powerful concentration of tanks and mechanized forces Germany had ever assembled. And in the first weeks of the campaign, the results were staggering. At Minsk, German forces encircled Soviet armies in a pocket that yielded hundreds of thousands of prisoners. At Smolensk, another massive encirclement. The Soviet forces were being hit faster than they could respond, cut off before they could retreat, destroyed in pockets while German armor was already driving deeper into the country. The numbers from those early months are almost impossible to wrap your head around. The Soviet Union lost more men in the first few months of Barbarossa than most countries had in their entire military histories. And still they kept fighting. That was the thing that started making German commanders nervous. France had collapsed. Poland had collapsed. The Soviets kept coming back. The distances were also doing something to the German military machine that nobody had fully planned for. The Soviet Union was simply bigger than France, bigger than Poland, bigger than the German logistics system was designed to handle. Fuel was constantly running short. Vehicles were breaking down. The supply lines were stretching thinner and thinner the further the advance went. By autumn 1941, the German advance was slowing. By winter, it had stalled in the frozen mud outside Moscow, with German soldiers in summer uniforms freezing to death because nobody had planned for the campaign to last past the autumn. Hoth adapted. That was one thing about him. He wasn't a one-trick commander who only worked in ideal conditions. He shifted from the fluid, fast-moving operations of the early war to the grinding defensive battles that the Eastern Front was becoming. He was given command of the 17th Army. Then in 1942, he received the command that would define everything that came after. The 4th Panzer Army, summer 1942. Case Blue, Germany's massive southern offensive. The strategic logic was sound on paper. The German war machine was running on oil, and most of Germany's oil was coming from Romania. Capturing the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus would both strengthen Germany and cripple the Soviet war effort. The plan called for a massive drive southeast, toward the Caucasus, toward the Volga, toward a city on the river bend that would give its name to the most important battle of the war. Stalingrad. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army was one of the primary instruments of the summer offensive. His forces drove hard through the summer heat, pushing Soviet armies back across the open steppe, making the kind of rapid progress that looked on maps like the early victories of 1941. The city was reached, the fighting began, and then it didn't stop. What happened at Stalingrad between August and November 1942 was unlike anything the German military had experienced. The city became a grinding, block-by-block, building-by-building nightmare where all the advantages of German armored warfare, speed, maneuver, deep penetration, simply didn't apply. In the rubble of a burning city, everything came down to small units fighting over individual floors of individual buildings. The Soviets were defending with a ferocity that shocked even veterans of the Eastern Front. The German Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus was being consumed by the battle. Division after division was fed into the city and chewed up. The flanks of the German salient were held by Romanian and Italian armies, Allied forces that were less well equipped and less experienced than the German units in the city. Soviet commanders noticed the flanks. On November 19th and 20th, 1942, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. Two massive armored thrusts, one from the north and one from the south, targeting exactly those weaker flanks. The Romanian armies collapsed almost immediately. Soviet tanks drove deep from both directions, met at the town of Kalash on November 23rd, and closed the trap. 300,000 German and Axis soldiers were surrounded. The Sixth Army was cut off. The German High Command had a choice to make, and the choice they made led directly to Hermann Hoth's most famous moment. Hitler refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out. His order was to hold Stalingrad, to stand fast, to wait for relief. Paulus followed the order, and so the plan became a relief operation. Punch through the Soviet encirclement from outside, open a corridor, supply the trapped army until it could fight its way out. Hoth was given the relief force. Operation Winter Storm, December 1942. He had a collection of panzer divisions, some experienced, some freshly arrived from Western Europe, and not yet adjusted to the conditions of the Eastern Front. The conditions were brutal. Temperature dropping to -20, -30. Frozen ground, frozen rivers, frozen engines that had to be warmed with open flames before they would start. Blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing. And Soviet forces determined to hold the encirclement closed. Hoth drove them anyway. His forces fought through resistance that would have stopped less determined commanders. They crossed the Oksai River. They crossed the Mishkova River. They pushed back Soviet units that were trying to hold them off. The advance was costly and grinding, but it was moving. By December 19th, his lead elements were 48 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket. And there it stopped. The Sixth Army wasn't coming out to meet them. Paulus was waiting for explicit authorization from Hitler, and Hitler wasn't giving it. The relief force didn't have the strength to fight all the way into the pocket and simultaneously support a breakout. And on December 16th, the Soviets had launched yet another offensive, Operation Little Saturn, that threatened to cut off Hoth's relief force itself by smashing through the Italian army further to the west. Hoth's advance stalled. Then it was forced back. The relief attempt had failed. In February 1943, the survivors of the Sixth Army surrendered. Barely 90,000 men out of 300,000, the rest dead from combat, cold, and starvation. Paulus himself was captured. It was the most catastrophic German defeat of the entire war, the moment when the tide turned and never turned back. Could Hoth have done more in those 48 kilometers? Could a harder push, a more aggressive gamble, have changed everything? Historians have argued about it ever since. The honest answer is probably no, not because of anything Hoth did wrong, but because the fundamental problem was Hitler's refusal to let Paulus break out. You can't relieve an army that won't move toward you, but the debate has never fully closed, and those 48 kilometers have haunted Hoth's legacy ever since. The war continued. Kursk, July 1943. The largest tank battle in history, Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army formed the southern pincer of the German attack. His forces actually made more progress than the northern pincer, cracking through multiple Soviet defensive lines with some of the most intense armored fighting of the entire war. But the overall offensive failed. The northern attack was called off after the Allied landings in Sicily created a crisis elsewhere. The momentum was gone. After Kursk, Germany never attacked strategically in the east again. Hoth was relieved of command in November 1943. The official reason was disagreements with Hitler over tactical decisions. Hoth believed in trading space for time, pulling back when necessary to preserve his forces, fighting the kind of flexible mobile defense that the situation demanded. Hitler believed in holding every meter of ground, regardless of cost. These two philosophies were completely incompatible, and by late 1943, Hitler was running out of patience with commanders who argued with him. Hoth never held another field command. He spent the rest of the war in various staff positions, watching the army he had helped build get ground down to nothing. Germany surrendered in May 1945. Hoth was captured by American forces, and 2 years later he found himself in a Nuremberg courtroom, not in the main trial of the senior Nazi leadership, but in the subsequent Nuremberg trials that dealt with military commanders. The charge that mattered most was not about anything Hoth had done on the battlefield. It was about orders, specifically the criminal orders that the German military issued regarding the treatment of Soviet civilians and prisoners of war. These orders were real and documented. The Commissar order, directing that Soviet political officers captured in combat were to be shot immediately rather than treated as prisoners of war. Orders regarding collective reprisals against civilians in areas where partisan activity occurred. Orders that stripped whole categories of people of the protections that international law was supposed to guarantee. Hoth had received these orders. He had passed them down to his forces. The prosecution argued that he knew they were criminal and passed them on anyway. That soldiers under his command had carried out executions of prisoners and reprisals against civilians as a direct result. Hoth's defense was the standard defense of German commanders at Nuremberg. He was a soldier following the legal orders of his government, operating within the military chain of command, in conditions of total war against an enemy that itself didn't follow the rules of war. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the Geneva Convention. Partisan warfare was creating genuine military problems that required extreme responses. The tribunal rejected the defense. In 1948, Hermann Hoth was convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. He served less than 5. In 1954, he was released as part of a general amnesty for German war criminals. He was 68 years old. He spent his remaining years writing military memoirs and history, technical, professional accounts of the campaigns he had commanded, focused almost entirely on operational and tactical questions. The broader context of what the war had meant, what had happened to the Soviet civilians in the territory his armies had moved through. These things appear at the edges of his writing, if at all. He died on January 25, 1971, at the age of 85. Hermann Hoth was one of the most capable armored commanders of the Second World War. That's not a controversial statement. It's supported by the operational record. the Meuse crossing in France, the encirclements of Barbarossa, the near miracle of Operation Winter Storm, the southern pincer at Kursk. These were real achievements, executed under extreme pressure, against serious opposition. And his armies moved through Soviet territory, leaving a trail of dead civilians and executed prisoners behind them. That's also supported by the record, not because Hoth was uniquely savage or personally motivated by ideology, he wasn't, particularly, but because the orders came down through his command, and he passed them on, and people died as a result. The uncomfortable thing about Hoth, the thing that makes him harder to dismiss than a straightforward fanatic, is that he was fundamentally a professional. A man who approached war as a craft, who was genuinely good at that craft, and who applied that professionalism within a system that was using it for purposes that went far beyond anything a professional soldier should have been party to. He knew the Commissar order was not a normal military order. Every senior German commander knew that. Some refused to implement it. Hoth didn't refuse. That's the choice that defined him in the end. Not the 48 kilometers. Not Kursk. Not the Meuse crossing. The choice to pass down orders he knew were wrong, in a war he knew had stopped being about anything a soldier could call honorable. 48 kilometers from Stalingrad. That's how people remember Hermann Hoth. But the fuller picture is more complicated and more uncomfortable than a story about a near miss in the snow.